Plants, Lesson 7.4, Water and Food Structures. So just in the last lesson, we talked quickly about xylem and phloem, but in this lesson, we're going to go a little bit more in depth of what they actually are. So xylem transports water and minerals from the soil to all parts of the plant. So xylem, think water and minerals. It's a one-way only, and it has no end walls between the cells and thick walls. It has really thick walls. Phloem, on the other hand, transports sugars from the leaves to all parts of the plant. So phloem, think more food, sometimes water, but mainly food. Cells have end walls and perforations. So in phloem, it has little tiny holes in it, which become important later, and it has a two-way flow. So water transport. So root hairs, remember we talked about those, they increase the surface area. They absorb minerals from the soil via active transport. So energy required for this process comes from cellular respiration, which we'll learn about soon, but it's essentially what plants go through in order to quote unquote breathe and get food of the carbohydrates in the root cells. Once inside, the minerals move through the cortex and through the endodermal cells to the center of the root. So root pressure. So this also becomes important for the transport because the accumulation of water and dissolved minerals creates root pressure. So all that water and minerals build up, and they push the sap up the xylem, and then the root pressure moves the xylem sap up a few more meters, and then eventually it will reach the top. So root pressure is important for that transport up the xylem. It gets it going, and it's essentially just a buildup and accumulation of water and dissolved minerals. So here we get to the actual transport in the stem. So for xylem, it has two ways. It's cohesion and adhesion. So cohesion is the ability of water to stick to itself. So if you think back to chemistry, if you took chemistry, the bonds of H2O, they pull and stick to each other due to something called a hydrogen bond, if you remember learning that. Again, due to the hydrogen bond holding adjacent water molecules together, it creates a very, very, very strong force of attraction. And the cohesion of the water molecules in the xylem creates a column of water that's super strong compared to the strength of a steel wire. And it requires a quote-unquote pull at the top of the column. Adhesion, on the other hand, is the ability of water to cling to a variety of non-oily surfaces. So this actually helps pull water up the xylem. The water sticks to the inner walls of the xylem. So both these ways do their own thing to help carry things up the xylem. Transpiration. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about transpiration last time, but essentially what it is most of the water entering through the leaves is lost through transpiration. So as each water molecule evaporates, it pulls on the adjacent water molecules, so all the way down to the root hairs, and energy required for transpiration comes from heat and air in the surrounding plant. So there's just a little diagram for you to understand transpiration. So now that we understand how the water and the minerals go through the xylem, let's talk about the food transport, which is the phloem. So phloem are living cells with cytoplasm and organelles, whereas xylem are mostly dead and hollow. So for the phloem, you can already see how different the transport is going to be. So the way we describe a phloem's transport is from source to sink. So the source are the leaf cells and the sink are the storage cells in the roots. So the sugars are pumped into the phloem in leaves by active transport. Remember, we learned about active transport a few slides back. It creates a hypertonic environment which causes water to flow into phloem cells via osmosis from adjacent xylem, and we'll learn about osmosis in a few seconds. Okay, so I know I probably just threw a ton of information at you that probably doesn't make a ton of sense about how xylem and phloem transport things, but all you really need to know for grade 11 biology is this chart right here. So I'll break it down for you quickly. So the direction of xylem is essentially up the roots through to the leaves is the transport of water and minerals. What it contains is xylem sap, which is the water and the nutrients. Essentially, xylem's structure is really hollow and it has dead cells that are mainly tubes with some smaller ones and some bigger ones. And what drives the flow of xylem is the root pressure that we talked about, that cohesion and adhesion, and then that transpiration that we talked about. Phloem, on the other hand, is, remember, it's the flow down, so xylem is up, phloem is down, and it's from source to sink. The source is the location of photosynthesis, and the sink is where sugar is stored in the form of starch. What it contains, so phloem contains sugars produced in photosynthesis. Its structure is a stacked living cells with membranes that have little tiny holes where that sugar and fluid build up to create the pressure. So what drives the flow is that when those holes get all filled up and the pressure starts to build, it accumulates and the cell fills up with sugars which are then carried. So this is all the chart that you need to know to make you understand xylem versus phloem. So the last thing we have to talk about is water transport in non-vascular plants or bryophytes. So all those other times, everything that we just talked about up until this point were for vascular plants only. Non-vascular plants have a little bit of a different path. So things like mosses, liverworts, hornworts, stuff that we talked about in Unit 1 are non-vascular plants. Some of them, remember in our chart that we made the bryophytes. So they have no xylem or phloem, so they have to live in a super wet or shady environment. The water moves from the actual environment and from cell to cell via osmosis. And we don't talk a ton about osmosis, but what it essentially is how the plants absorb water from the actual soil. And that's it.